Welcome, everyone, to History Gone Wilder, part of
Oh,
Half History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder
very well.
historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and I am here with Dr. Tom Mackie. This is our first, or my first interview I'll be conducting on the channel, and I'm so happy to have you here. So thank you for joining me.
Hey, I'm glad to be here. Anything to stay active.
I tell you, you are the longest running scholar that I know
Oh,
because,
wow.
yeah, I've known you since I was around 13 years old. Um, you were working at the Abraham Lincoln Library
Yeah,
and
that's right.
Museum.
That's right. You got to back to the museum.
Yes, and you
Yeah.
took me and
Oh,
showed me
that's right.
my
Oh, my word.
Yeah, show me my
Oh,
ancestors'
thank you. I
uniform.
now, yeah, right. That's right. Oh, my goodness. Oh, well, I was thinking back. There were some other activities. Oh, Michael Lynch was just barely he just barely graduated himself. Uh, when I started out there, and now he's the director.
Mhm.
And then folks, I said, and I realized, you know, it's been some years at some national park, and others had published those books on the national park in Cumberland Gap. And I realized, oh, it's been 9 years. Oh my goodness, I'm just kind of. But I was thinking, well, my daughter who worked for the Park Service as a volunteer, she's been married over 5 years. She's been out of state. So, oh my. So yeah, the time has moved very fast. You don't
And
realize how things go on. And I've outlived a lot of my colleagues professionally. I simply could not give up. I either as stubbornness or I didn't know what else to do with my life.
well, it's
There's so many others that have struggled, and particularly in the museum field, it has not been healthy at all. It's not been a healthy world. So, anywhere, anywhere. All
yeah.
right.
Well, I- I'll have to say, and it's
Yeah,
full
I put some of
disclosure.
my toys out here when you.
Yes, I'm glad you put out the toys because we're going to be talking all about Abraham Lincoln, all kinds of stuff about Abraham Lincoln. But I want
Yeah.
to talk a little bit about why Abraham Lincoln. Why are we drawn to him? It seems like there's so many scholars. If you hear about the Civil War, they know, well, they are very intertwined with Abraham Lincoln because he is this megalithic figure in a lot of ways to the Civil War. Why do you think we're drawn to him?
I'm thinking, if you want to be immortal, you need to make sure you can die in a very public, horrible way. That kind of builds immortality to the public personality. Other than it's kind of hard. It's kind of hard to gauge. Except I think the Civil War, it defines us. Not only right after Civil War Reconstruction, the 1890s, the revival of in the 20s, all this, these are powerful images, and I think Lincoln is sucked into it. And so much the romantic image, and that's embedded in us. Think about we're a little like we take the romantic image of the Scottish Romance movement, very with Robert Wallace, William Wallace and Robert the Bruce, Rob Roy, and Brendan Prince Charlie, and we shove it those kind of lost cause romantic images, and that's basically what our Civil War is. It's extremely charged cultural soup um, of personal reactions, and everybody. And think about it. By 1865, if the southern numbers are right, we're looking at 700 plus thousand have already died. A lot of guys are on a short lifespan because they've been injured, they've been sick, and their lives are forever ruined. They never sobered up, they never got off morphine, they never could work again, or they were simply disturbed, that emotionally harmed due to the experiences, let alone the numbers that simply didn't come home. And so everybody knows somebody who they lost, and everybody's going to write themselves into that narrative. And Lincoln is, the funeral, which is a very big public thing. Republicans are going to great lengths to make it so. I mean, this was a staged event. 2 million some people watched it, one way or the other. They go to the train, and I think with from some other historians have mentioned that it's the kids though. It's the people maybe not who are adults during the Civil War, but younger, and they remembered it too. But they remembered it from their parents' eyes. They kind of exaggerated it. So when they become adults in the 1890s and 80s, all of a sudden the Lincoln Commemoration, which they kind of remembered, just blossoms and surpasses Washington. Before the 1890s, Washington is your ultimate hero. The Mount Vernon pilgrimage is the ultimate place. And all of a sudden, but before the centennial in 1909, Lincoln has passed that point. There are more books, more articles, more materials out, and there's statues popping up like so many little marble daffodils, popping up everywhere, depicting some element of Lincoln's life. Usually one of the more elegant ones, although there are a few statues. My toys here represent the two images. So you have the local image, which kind of places the frontier and all those thoughts, the Lincoln logs. And then I have this a pretty awful thing. It's a Easter candle with Lincoln's image on it. Really awful. It has so many bad. It depicts this absurdly reverential treatment that we tend to give our heroes. And Lincoln is at the highest pantheon of this era. And so and it continued all the way through the 20th century. Civil rights kind of kicked it in damage it a bit, because you start looking at the other stories. As you remember, when you went to grad school, how many other stories did you have to start looking at? Okay, it's that complexity starts to get smack you up. And I still remember being on. Who was I ever to him? No. I think back at myself going, wow, Mackie, you didn't have it together at all, did you?
I don't think any of us did.
You matured. No, you don't. But that wakes you up a little bit, the complexity. But I think for most people in our society, they wanted a simpler answer, and they wanted to commemorate something. Lincoln became this fluid way of remembering things. So even a lot of Southerners, the New South, like and Woodrow Wilson's age, you can kind of play with that idea, and Lincoln kind of, you could ignore the slave side of things. You could ignore the hard work. You could ignore a lot of things. You just, direct your gaze a little differently. Certain things were just kind of not talked about. I think in any of the blue-gray reunions, I think a lot of guys simply had to not talk about some things. I do remember one of the Gettysburg reunions, and these guys were already in their 80s by this time, or older. Some of you guys are very old. And there was a knife fight pulled out one of the time, over a Lincoln comment. So even though these are old guys who probably couldn't even hurt each other by this time, think about the anger that still remains, though. And I think we have to remember, all right, that's still a lot of unresolved issues, to use a psychologist term, on a national level. So I think everybody in the country, just about, unless you're a new arrival, they had that baggage into the 20th century. They, that war, left people behind. How many people came home in their houses? Those veterans pictures, and so probably even more so than World War II. One, people remembered that and something they had to adapt to deal with. Then, ironically, we build on our tourism in the late 19th century, patriotic tourism, particularly. I love the Lincoln vacation, what was called a pilgrimage. I mean, visit as many Lincoln sites, and they would call called shrines, including the one we both were at. LMU was enshrined
Mhm.
at the tercentenary of the Abraham Lincoln's arrival in America. I think in 27. There was 37, 1937. There was this great tour, and the guy would our Joe McMurtry would become director of our museum. Uh, um, wasn't there yet, but he helped host or organize this, and made sure LMU was on that list as soon as this tour left Massachusetts, went to Pennsylvania, then down the valley, and then across the Cumberland Gap. When they have a day at, I think there was I think they had believe LMU put out a play on Lincoln, pageant of sorts, and that's where that monument behind the museum comes from, that time period. A little cairn up back there. Another throwback to, I'm thinking of the Culloden image. This is another research project rolling around in my mind here. So you have this really this romantic, powerful romantic image that still stays with us. And these are elements of that. When people, it seems foreign right now, I think, to most of us. It took me a while. In fact, I only got into it because I had to. When you do a PhD dissertation, sometimes you don't really have a lot of choice unless you have a set dynamite in a collection. They're going to give you something to finish up with, and okay, and since I worked in museums for 40 years, I'll just live with following orders. I'll take this, and here we go.
It's best to take
Which
their advice whenever they
means
give
I
it.
don't get, I feel I don't get really, man, if they get it, shut up and take the advice and go.
Yes.
And I think, and since yeah, I had to do it twice. So my first one was actually poorhouses, and that was my original. But when I had a gap in the studies, when I came back, I was the director of a museum, and they got so giggly happy. So then brought me back, took all my credits, and they said, "But now you're a Lincoln Scholar." I said, "What?" Because I felt that was hard, because everybody does Lincoln. It's just like, there are all sorts of specialized um, historical agencies and conferences out there, but they're not that big. There's they may have 40, 50 to 100 people. You go to a big Lincoln conference, there's like 400 people there. And like the Lincoln Forum in Gettysburg, there's like 300-400 people at that event. Or the Abraham Lincoln Association conference. Those are not little venues. Those are, and a lot of historians show up to the, as well as the eager amateurs, those who simply love the field. They might sell insurance, but they might sell bonds, but doggone it, they love their Lincoln, and they've read 79 books about Lincoln. I'm thinking of several left in my mind right now. That they're very determined they're going to do this right. So it still stays with us. The Lincoln cult is alive and well, and it shows up even in the sheer number of the Lincoln sites. Mention what they call them, but not all museums. There are a lot of houses. Indiana, Iowa Wesleyan University has a house associated with Robert Todd Lincoln and his wife, Mary Harlan Lincoln, where she grew up. That might be in danger to be closed because the university just was closed up. But Hildene in Vermont, another, not really Abraham Lincoln at all, but his family. So it's kind of anything connected to Lincoln, they get pulled into the vortex of Lincoln interest, or Lincolniana, as the expression goes.
Yeah. One thing I remember from your class, and I took your human geography class, and it's one of the classes that has always stayed with me, no matter where I've taught or no matter what I've done. I've always carried a lot of that information with me, and I appreciate that so much from you. But I remember one thing that you told me, or told the class, that is when Lincoln passes away, people rush to central Kentucky looking for all kinds of logs from his cabin. Now, you told the class, and I found it very funny that you could build 1,000 cabins with how many logs actually that they claim came from his actual cabin. And so Could you speak a little bit about
Um,
that? Everybody, you've already talked about it a little bit, but
yeah,
actually, what is that fascination that we want a piece of him? Somehow we need a piece of Abraham Lincoln.
I want to combine two things. I think there's or maybe two or three things that combine into that one. Birthplace is important when we look at this romantic image. I mentioned earlier this romantic image of our founders, of our heroes. The birthplaces are important. Um, there's one. Turner's thesis on the frontier. Um, the luckiest historian around who got, whose address to a bunch of historians becomes a cultural, slogan almost. The frontier hypothesis. And then, of course, Lincoln's memory. So at the local level, people were looking back. By the time really Lincoln, even now, maybe even before that, they wanted to say, okay, what's the real Lincoln? Like Raymond Herndon was after, what was that real Lincoln? So going to that site, and because this romantic haze that you needed a piece, they weren't collecting objects for study. They were collecting objects to revere. And it didn't matter, like a holy relic, a piece of the true cross, that it was only a piece. You could take it apart each any sense. The curator, it makes no sense at all. It's a horrifying thought, and it causes us, to wake up in the dead of night with a cold sweat. But for example, the very first of his collections was actually the rails that his cousin brought in to the Republican meeting there in Illinois, where he brought in what a fence rail, and then finally just bought and towed down the whole darn fence, and distributed these rails, whether or not they were from the right fence. Lincoln didn't know. They were fence rails. Dennis was probably not the most carefully descriptive of things. I don't know how accurate he was in some things like this, but he found fence rails, and it becomes a marketing tool. I'm always suspicious when marketers get a hold of things, and so there it goes. So those become one type of relic. But after the election and after Lincoln dies, many of these are made into something else. For example, you remember at the museum collection, there was the Iowa Haworth's cane and gavel made from one of those fence rails. Then on top of that one, you see a bunch of those sold, and I use that word carefully, at once. I think it was one of the World's Fairs in Chicago, where they sliced the darn thing, the little wafers, hundreds of little wafers, sold for a great deal of money, with a certificate of authenticity. There's the important part. Authenticity. What do you mean by authenticity? Well, it came from the fence. You go back into Rockport, Indiana. It's a place that's south of us, where I live now. And what was authentic was they used old logs to do a reconstructed house. Yes, the house was only about a third the size of the real house, but it was authentic because you used 150, 200-year-old logs.
Mm-hmm.
Authenticity has an uncertainty about, yeah, but this object, these molecules were there when Lincoln was there. Okay. And being also, if you remember, we talked about, that course, because I love geography, and particularly folk geography. I absolutely got giggly. My favorite artifact was folk housing, and log housing, even above that. So I just loved certain kinds of folk houses. And so when I really began studying Lincoln museums, and I saw these log houses, and I use the word in quotes because they were awful. Most of them are terribly what were you thinking? What model did you use? The Lord, Mike, no, this is just not right. I've seen some that look like a 1920s fishing cottage. Others that look like something the Lincoln logs were built. I said, what did you do? I said, he's not a log house, it's not even a decent pig pen, let alone a house. And everybody had pieces and pieces. So, but it's Mount Vernon did this. We had you had the people who were still enslaved at the plantation after Washington died, who would give tours to people visiting Mount Vernon, and then they would sell canes made from walking, made walking sticks and canes, harvested basically from the plantation. People would pay for those things, those keepsakes, because they're organic, they're grown in the ground of this area, and that's a very powerful image. Remember, this is the same time period people, kept hair from a person who died, a relative who died, and made wreaths out of his hair. I remember having so much fun with two young junior high girls at the Indiana State Museum. They were studying the hair wreaths, and I told them about the tradition of using their hair to make these wreaths. And when they realized what it was, they got so creeped out. It was wonderful. I just I enjoyed it. I enjoyed doing that. But the logs function like this, like here. They're organic, and they're personal, and they're authentic because they're old. And all you need is a little piece of one. You don't need the whole piece of it. So, but then you start realizing people are marketing this. And so they're going back to Illinois, maybe or not, and just cutting fence rails, or they're cutting trees and selling organic souvenirs. And how many can you get off of, a shaving of a tree, a stump, any number of things, let alone dried flowers. I mean, I think when you remember being in the museum archives, how many times Michelle would find dried flowers in an old Lincoln books. Oh, no, get this thing out of here. Why not? Who put the thing in that? Michelle would be quite irritated at somebody who died 80 years ago. But that was a dried flower, probably from a birthplace in Lincoln, or the home place in Indiana, a piece of grass, that's that organic memory. You were there, kind of you're writing yourself into the story. And I think logs, because they also represent the frontier, which we revere. We had this, thank you, Turner, this reverence for that frontier image, that piece. So, and the booster looks at this thing. They see money. Mm-hmm. One tree's as good as another. One fence is good as another, isn't it? It's a fence. They're not going to know. I remember one museum director telling me this. Obviously didn't last there long. Because they said, well, no one's going to know, Tom, but you. Yeah, I'm going to know. That's the problem. I'm going to know.
That means a lot.
That means a lot. People expect you, the historian, the public or academic, to be honest with them, mm-hmm. to tell as full a story as they can handle, leaving them to understand that there's more to it. Yep. A little like the gospel messages, Jesus saying, there's more I need to tell you, but you can't handle it right now. Many visitors, there's only so much you can absorb right now, but I want you to come back and grab some more. Yep. Here's your first book. If you realize that just that much, that you can begin really learning out of that one. But the logs are a very powerful image. It just fascinated me that when I looked at the museum, how many, and then I went to other museums. I was in Indiana, I was in Illinois. I was over in the National Park Service collections, and I was at the Smothers, and I thought they're all the same. I see lots of organic material, lots of pieces of log. Mm-hmm. I said, dude, you put all these logs together. I'm going to have a log town. I'm not going to have a log town here. Because of all the, but the boosters who get involved in this. And that's kind of thing about when I read my book, is that boosters really told the story, particularly when we get toward the later 19th, early 20th century. This element of dime museums comes in, and it's accuracy gets a little careless. At least in our profession, we're going to use the word accuracy. It's some integrity behind the story, the material. We mean something a bit different than what some of these folks did. It's an old log. I don't care where it came from, how old or not old. We don't know. it's old, and we'll cut it up, and then we can make money off this one, and they have something that they can hold and put on their wall at home, saying I was at the Lincoln birthplace and the boyhood home. I mean, Oldroyd sold bits and pieces of the tree up front yard, the Lincoln home. So you have it's a long history of this of that.
Well, I'm fascinated that you linked Abraham Lincoln's memory with the frontier, going off of Frederick Jackson Turner's thesis. I hadn't put
Oh yeah,
those two together. And I don't think people realize how important to historians, but also to the just the general
yeah,
public in the late 1800s, early 1900s, people thought of the frontier as that's how you became American. That was the process. The
yeah.
frontier wasn't a actual place. The frontier was a process by which you became Americans. And you linking those
Yeah.
together. So this makes Lincoln, if you like Lincoln, you become more American through Abraham Lincoln in a way.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I love collecting coins and little
uh-huh.
medallions and things. And I found of course, off eBay, I found a coin from the World's Fair in Chicago, and
Ooh,
it had a image of George Washington. Next was Abraham Lincoln, and then the next one was Ulysses S. Grant, because
ooh,
Grant had been kind of bestowed by Lincoln as the heir of George Washington being named a lieutenant general. He becomes
yeah,
almost that image at the time, and Lincoln helps foster that. And so that just
yeah.
fascinates me that you brought that up about the frontier. And then of course we can talk about the World's Fair as well. But I find that fascinating, and also fascinating that they were lumping Grant in with that.
Mhm. I think a lot of people, if you look at the presidential histories that came out in the early 20th century, or even textbooks. In fact, I've got a friend of mine gave me a 1959 U.S. history textbook. I'm kind of digging through it, and I see a lot of that. That post World War II, the need for an extreme, a clean patriotism, something that does not have it has a simple message. You don't want to go in deep. You want to create an image. It's an image making thing. It's not really history. It's heritage.
Mhm.
Um, and so it lacks the complexity. It lacks that. Yeah, but so yeah, but wait a minute. Oh, wait a minute. It's more than that. So, but you have to kind of and it takes patience to grab that. It takes a lot of patience. It took me forever. I mean, I have to speak, the sins of my own self, and how long it took me to outgrow um, being a baby boomer. Growing up in the nuclear age, and growing up in going to vacation in the 50s and 60s, when the museums were very careful about those images. And they realize, okay, there's a lot more complex than this, and that and politics gets woven into this. We weave our faith, we weave our politics, all gets woven in to how we look at the past. Past is basically how we're kind of, we construct that history of ours. So we construct ourselves, and so it gets a little rough sometimes in our field, particularly in the last 20 years. um, it just so some of us a little longer to figure that out.
Well, something you
So,
mentioned to me,
but yeah, I think I remember.
something you
Go
mentioned
ahead.
to me when we were discussing coming on is presidential pilgrimages and how presidents, um,
Yeah,
well, you go to presidential locations, but also how presidents view former presidents. And Abraham Lincoln is quoted by all kinds of presidents from the time he's assassinated up until now. We get presidents who honor him in many different ways. Um, I think there's something to that because of him bringing a country through one of the most devastating, if not
yeah,
the most devastating conflict in America's history. And people refer back to that because if you link yourself with Lincoln, you become somewhat like him.
right.
You got to
But
be close to him.
yeah, you had that Americanness.
Mhm.
That as kind of a generic accepted, because his image is so fluid. you have people in the wide range of political spectrums all revering Lincoln for entirely different reasons. Not all very accurate, but they've got their own reasons. So you have this, with the exception of when you go to the extreme left and right in our political spectrums, where you see the Lincoln as the great racist, or you see him as a tyrant. You start whiplashing back and forth. That tends to be our wings will do that. But even in his age, he was not well liked. There was a lot of people throughout the land who were not prepared for anything remotely looking like African American equality. Just were. Now, I'm reading on that right now, and working in my own book, trying to get my head around that idea that how Lincoln is viewed in the 60s and 70s. There was a quote in a memoir about visitors looking at the Emancipation Proclamation, and they're angry about it. Because they've started to turn against it. Again, because the message has been too simple. It's a lot, good or bad, there's a lot more here. You're not seeing everything. And it's hard, but you have to take time with visitors or or your students to bring them in to the complex story. And I remember when I was teaching high school for a little bit, I really got their attention doing one thing. I said, listen, if you get this on a test, standardized test, this is the answer. I look around. However, they all go, lean into, I gotcha. I'm still the interpreter.
History is so complex, and when you try to boil it down to generalizations, you sometimes you warp it if you boil it down too much.
You cheapen it, and you give a entirely wrong message. Entirely wrong message. But I think if people are honest, sometimes they get the oh wow moment when they realize, oh, this is bigger than I ever thought. And I think you get expanded, and that's where I want to see anyone come to terms, whether or not they're coming into the left or the right, to look at this saying, oh, this is much more complex than I ever thought. And I love that, which is, but the trouble is that it also has made me a bit of a curmudgeon at my old age now, because I really don't like heritage as much. I get very impatient with heritage celebrations, which have a simple emotional response. Now, I love the artwork for some things. Okay, that's good, that's nice, a lot of good music, emotional, nice, like that chord. And then I went, but the history is really kind of dodgy, And it bothers me. On YouTube, there's this really emotional, it's well written depiction of the bombing of Fort McHenry, and it's heritage. It's horribly inaccurate. It's tremendously inaccurate. It's exaggerated, and it has wrong emphases, and there are some things that are completely false. But they're woven in so well, it makes this emotional, musical experience, and you feel patriotic, you feel happy. And I said, but it's wrong. It's a lot more complex than this. It's tremendously more. And in fact, the story is stunning. The British troops, the British Marines used to help soften up or to test the defense of Fort McHenry were formerly enslaved African Americans who are now trained by the British Marines. And they were the shock troops. Open your eyes, boys and girls. This is more complex. This is fascinating. So with Lincoln, it's even more so because it is so central to our identity. Because we're a federal democracy, a republic, or a democratic republic. We have this, and we apologize. I don't know. I can't remember their person's name. But to a nation to be born in revolution is to always be in jeopardy of chaos. We're always going to be touching that zone. And I think I told your class, you can never tell where the revolution is going to go. Be careful about your revolution you start, because you don't know, it's out of your hands. Once it starts, it's out of your hands, and you don't know where it's going to go. And right now, our book club, the Poor Richard's book club, we're looking at a biography of Samuel Adams. And the poor guy seemed to outlive his usefulness by the time of the Constitution. He was what do you do with him? He's trying to be an orderly person, but his whole history has been to disturb things. So he has a hard time, and people have a hard time with him because of his personality. But it's important to understand that thing about people, about Lincoln. How, what kind of odd character was he? His quirks as well as his glories are important. The mistakes he made at the beginning of the war. Telling McDowell, you're both green. And I've talked to other veterans, and when class I taught here at IU East, I have a Marine Corps veteran in my class, and I use that quote because he realized a green soldier is the most dangerous one out there, but not to the enemy. And everybody else around. Dude, you have no idea what you just said. The carelessness the last months in Vietnam, the U.S. troops in Vietnam, higher casualties because you had carelessness. You had green guys who were green guys thrown in, not ready. You had all sorts of problems when you had green troops. Manassas, Bull Run was an example of that. You had green troops, very green. Panic easily. Mistakes will be made. Not might be, will be. All depends on who screws up the word. But the very statement of saying you're both green is a horrifying thought, a lack of understanding of what this means. But he's a politician. I think, remember, he is a politician, not a soldier. He understands public relations. He understands emphasis. He understands how to move things. I thought of recently, Lincoln, though, had to have a person like Frederick Douglass. He has to have that because he's got to be pushed by the activist. The activist has got to have Lincoln in order to make things work. Not just let him go on his own. They've got to be pushed. There's this combination of things. I think that's how we survived. In many ways, I think it's how we survived this time period. You had an activist group pushing a good legalist, keeping the pressure on. And I think that's kind of what made that work. I don't think a different combination would have done as well. But that's kind of like my random thoughts on
Oh,
that one.
it's great. This is from the Patreon. I'll start asking some questions that the Patreon members actually had for you about Abraham Lincoln, and I'm covering.
Okay.
I'm covering
Okay.
McClernand right now. Yeah, I'm covering
Okay.
John McClernand right now, and he in my biography series. And one of the Patreon members was commenting that they knew one another. McClernand and Abraham Lincoln had worked together throughout their time in Illinois politics.
That's
Their
right.
wives
Yeah.
were good friends. And
Yeah.
how did he balance his friendships with his politics? And we can't say McClernand was a friend, but we can say that they knew one another. And when McClernand is asking for independent command,
Yeah.
Abraham Lincoln puts his foot down. It's like, no, maybe not right now. So how does he do that balancing act?
Not always as well, except I don't think there was going to be a good way, because the very nature of military. Lincoln used the spoil system. In fact, if Lincoln had lived any longer, like in the 1880s when you had the civil service exams, Lincoln would have been aged out. He couldn't have done anything. He would have not known how to handle politics that age. He understood favors. The problem is favors and a war don't go together real well. So he had to be pretty rough. And from what I gathered, Lincoln had a real steel side to him. He was not He comes across as soft, but he's not. There's some really hard edges on him. But he tends to avoid direct conflict, to snap at somebody. When he does snap, Lincoln's is having a problem. When he loses his temper, he's having a problem. There's something else going on, and usually shows up with. I'm not sure with Clernan, but I know with mothers. For example, there was a Nicolay and Hay talked about visitors from Springfield were seen in line coming to the executive mansion to visit him. This is an example of what Lincoln would do to people. He knew his friendships and yet how he'd place those friendships. When he saw them coming up, he ran out to meet them and announced to everybody, my friends, so and so here, I am so glad they're here. They're not, they're coming here to volunteer. He's got them a volunteer position, they're going to be in the unit. He says, I am so glad they're never asking for a favor. I mean, he went ahead of them, gave them something they did not want. They wanted a job. Well, he gave them a job in the army. But he put them on the spot and they could not back out. And so that Lincoln was a manipulator. He was very good at that. He would have been a wonderful Sunday school superintendent, except he wasn't really a believer, But voluntold, Lincoln could do voluntold really, really, really well, and I think that was part of his charm and his exasperation at the same time. Nicolay and Hay said there was he could read a congressman coming in who was coming there for old bunkie, as they say, to say something for their constituents to know. I laid down the law. I told the president what you wanted to hear. And Lincoln was so good at turning him around, literally switching around, getting him laughing with a stupid joke or gag, and getting him right back out the door. And then the guy doesn't realize he has already been had until he's outside the White House going, shoot, he did it again to me. So he was very good at this personal manipulation, I guess. And for somebody who's really socially awkward, but the politician, he was a master. He was the master politician. That's a good thing, and it's a bad thing. People who knew Lincoln, who would technically have known Lincoln best, said, I don't know the guy at all. The guy, Herndon would, now Herndon would kind of make up thing. He believed Lincoln. He was trying to find Lincoln's hidden pain. Herndon was a hopeless romantic. Okay, he wanted to find Lincoln's hidden pain. Others simply said, I don't know what he's thinking. Because he doesn't tell you anything he's really showing. The guy is really close. And I think friends like well, sure, it's the same way. These are all political appointees. He's putting him in, but he's got to play with everybody. He's got to get everybody in the playground. But if they really screw up, he's got to be able to, toss them out. He would have tossed up McClellan, I think, long ago, except that he could not find, or at least believed he could find another commander. For the information Lincoln had at his desk, at his disposal, Grant may not have looked all that good. Or sure, others just, do you believe by the time he gets to 62, even before 63, he knows he can't believe most of the things that he's been told. He has to understand that I cannot believe everything I'm told. That has got to be rattling hard to grasp that one, which is why we start seeing him borrowing more and more books from the Library of Congress on military matters, so that he's not running cold in this. Each of the questions, and I think Lincoln, I don't think he has that friends. I think maybe the answer is he doesn't really have friends, not intimate friends. Nobody knows him. I don't think his wife knew him that well. I don't think his kids knew him that well. Like Robert Todd Lincoln, I think, was separate. Yeah, I don't think he I'm not sure he was incapable of close feelings. I don't know. I mean, you can't really read that from 150 years afterwards, but
Mm.
he does seem to be a person that is not very easily opened, even during his own time. And he didn't want to be. What was going on in his head, I don't know. One of the most intriguing stories of his interactiveness, I remember coming out of a book published by an old book published by the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. One of the elders in the 1890s was a little boy, 8-year-old boy during the Civil War, and he and a buddy remember seeing Lincoln's shadow in the prayer room during Wednesday evening service. And Lincoln's off the side. But they weren't sure that was him or not. They saw a shadow back there. So when service ended, these boys, and this is so 8-year-old boy, by the way, they guys run out in the snow and they follow this guy through the alleys, around the bend, and into the executive mansion. And Lincoln turns around saying, "Thank you for the escort, boys." You know, I said, "That's him.
Yeah.
That's him." You know, um, and I think when we're looking at generals like this, I think that's him. Maybe cold to an adult. Um, on the surface, very, very, very friendly, very engaging, but not deep. You're not gonna get. So I don't think it would bother Lincoln to turn a friend away
Mhm.
or something new because he doesn't really have anybody that close to him.
Right.
That's my apology. That's my long rabbit trail,
No, no.
mole hole answer.
No, that's perfectly fine. I like the answer. It seems like we always never know quite who Lincoln is, and that's why there's so many books on him, is because we are still trying to
Yeah,
understand the man
yeah,
himself.
yeah. And I think
Um,
that understands other politicians. I think it gives us a handle on why are some people very in our own lives. Maybe they're kind of like this. There's this personality quirk that they're not going to be close to anybody.
mhm. Yeah. Well, that kind of leads me to another question. It falls
All right.
kind of along with the Civil War, with the generals that he's having to deal with, and uh, I probably could answer this, but I really would like to have someone that focuses just on Abraham Lincoln to answer this question. Is Lincoln more patient with the generals out west than he
Yeah,
is with the east?
yeah.
I know that partially it's because the capitals are so close together that most of the focus is on the east, but does that translate into patience for the west as compared to the East being, you need to get this done now for me because the war is in our back door, literally.
Yeah. I think the press is the big thing here. I think Harold Holzer answered this when the press, it's their version of social media and it's exposed. It's in the press and it's right there. There's not that big a population out west. There really isn't. I mean, Tennessee is not that big a state in 1860. Kentucky, these aren't huge population bases. You don't have big cities out here. Um, and the newspaper information is diffused more. Whereas, yeah, the capitals are 90 miles from each other. There's an intensity, and there is a direct threat to your backyard. Lincoln is concerned losing the capital. That's a real concern. He knows by the end of 61, they can lose really badly, really quickly. He understands that this match might be over. You know, he knows that he can't show that, but I think he knows that. I think patience in the West is because politically it's just not that important. Sounds ghastly, but he weighs things politically. Where is the vote? Where is the newspaper editors? And all the big editors are in the East. They're not in the West. All the big names are New York, Philadelphia, they're Boston, they're in DC, but they're not, St. Louis. They're not, Chicago is not that big yet. So you don't have that weight of press information and large, populations pressing on you. That's that will come to later on. So I think his attention is focused on. He tend to be like he ran cases like that. He would ignore all sorts of points. Fine, I don't care. That's take it if he wouldn't try to defend some points he would only defend one point that would swing the case. So Lincoln itself is not after, like in a case, like a lot of lawyers, they're not really after truth. They're trying to win a case. And I think in this case, he's after the win of war. So he's not after the whole. He's trying to just win this one area first, because this is the one that is the point that's got to have. If I carry this point in the east, the west will come along with me. If I take Richmond, if Lee's army is destroyed, the west is going to fall too. The others can mop up, because particularly even by 62, late 62, most of Mississippi was no longer controlled by the Confederates. The Confederates were already hemmed in. Even though the Anaconda was not actually a published plan, it worked. The idea that you're going to squash, you're going to basically slowly, bit by bit, plug in the corners and squeeze them until they can't fight. You have to be patient. I think he was willing to be patient there because not as many were paying attention to it. Because even though New Orleans was a great victory early on, I don't think it got that much information, that got much spread. I don't think it got that big a notice. Why do we remember Gettysburg but not Vicksburg? Same weekend, dude. It's about the same week, same time. But we always, and I think we remember it now because in 1863, that was the big news.
Yes. It got overshadowed.
And it never, it has never come back.
Well,
it's still.
That's what my dissertation is about, Appalachia in the Civil War. And my argument is that Chattanooga, the capture of Chattanooga, that railroad hub that kind of was the arteries for the entire South, that was the turning point. When you are able to literally cut off all that agricultural supplies that's coming out of Tennessee, Alabama, going to those Eastern armies, that's when you get that turning point of the war is Chattanooga.
I think I get a good point. I think you got a good argument there, because you have so many other points that are stronger than the public ones. Lincoln understood the public ones. He understood what the public is going to see, because in 1864 he's got to run again. So again, he's a politician. You got to think of him as a politician. He's not a military commander. He is not an activist. Lord knows he is not an activist. He's a legalist. He's very conservative in many ways, but he is also fluid enough to understand where things are and should probably go. That's why the emancipation is important, and yet you realize it's not all there is. And I think the one thing I know, some historians have argued Lincoln does not really change. I says, no, I disagree with that rather strongly. Lincoln evolves. His commitments grow much stronger. I mean, it doesn't do a flip flop like a 180. No, he does. He pulled, sometimes kicking and screaming, but he's pulled in the reality. But his counterparts are rigid. Jeff Davis is rigid. They only see one thing. That the honor code, I've often talked the honor code, like reading Joanne Freeman's book about Field of Blood and some others on the honor code of the South. That honor code made Southern politics so rigid that I think it could not. I don't know how they got anything done. I have no idea how it would hold together, because the rigidity and the explosiveness of that honor code made compromise just about impossible sometimes. If anytime it just, dude, how do you hold this together? You're just, how's it gonna work? And I'm getting off trail here, but anyway, back to saying the Western theater, I think, could be ignored, not so much because his patience, but because there was no political no political movement screaming at him to fix this. And therefore, as the old style country attorney, I can ignore these points, because if I get this one, I get these two.
Yeah.
He understands that movement. If I gain the one, I gain them all. I get all the marbles. With it, with if I get that one big, that shiny Perry, I get all the marbles. I know the rules.
And that's fair enough. I know that besides Vicksburg, Lincoln saw the Stones River as being an important part of the war story. Even though people today, or even people back then, didn't think much of Stones River, it was the first major Union victory since the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. Literally 2 days when it goes into effect, and so that means a lot to him. Stones River does, but those Western battles, as you said, he has more patience because he's got more time to to wait for something to happen there. He
Yeah.
does not have that luxury in the East.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best that I can come up with. I don't really think myself as a Civil War historian because of the I spent more on Lincoln, although because of Lincoln, the Civil War gets absorbed in here.
Mhm.
I think one of my fascinating things about there are just certain elements. Of course, living in Appalachia that time when I did, that fascinated me. But what fascinated me more was the sheer volume of pro-unionists living in the Confederacy.
Mhm.
That made me think, okay, this is again, I had to learn that's a different story.
Yeah.
And yet those pro-unionists would become, and I love this one, pro-Confederate 20 years after the war.
Mhm. Right. And Marshall brings that up in
Marshall's
her
book,
book.
I love. I bought her book, I signed it. I said, and I've got to have this, because the memory studies. This screams at me collective memory,
Mhm.
cultural amnesia. Um, because I said this falls in line with us right now. We could meet ourselves in this one. I think we could see ourselves in that same zone, going back from Vietnam, going back to civil rights. Um, we flip flop. Well, we always believe. No, you didn't.
Well,
You know.
that also brings up another question that the Patreon members had was how Abraham Lincoln has a unique relationship with Andrew Johnson. And I'll say unique. If you want to
Yeah.
elaborate, you can elaborate any way you want to, but I want to build onto that. He has that relationship with Andrew Johnson, but how does Abraham Lincoln get thought of by the South? Because Andrew Johnson's a Southerner. How is Lincoln thought of, in that period right after his assassination up until, let's say, the 1890s, right before the Chicago World
Right.
Fairs comes around? That period of time, what do we see a transition in how the Southerners view him?
Yeah. I think it goes in line with the Blue Gray Reunion, the New South thinking. Now, I used to live in Lynchburg, Virginia, and a gentleman, a wonderfully curmudgeon named Jubal Early, lived there after his self-exile. The biggest laugh I think I have ever had, just on my own, was seeing where Jubal Early's statue is located, an African American neighborhood. I thought, oh, this is fun, but reading his material and reading, because that's you see that a lot in Lynchburg, and that is a radically neo-Confederate capital. It's an intensive emotional attachment, and yet I know very well within 15 miles of Lynchburg were utterly pro-Union zones in the Blue Ridge Mountains. I mean, hardenedly pro-Union. In fact, went out of their way to shoot Confederates, sniper Confederates. But that was kind of a hobby, I think, because they really didn't like them, and the grudge went back a long way earlier. So that complexity is there. Repeat that. No, go back to the question again. I'm gonna refresh my memory here.
Sorry, how did Southerners
But Southern,
view
yeah,
Abraham Lincoln, right after the assassination until about 1890
yeah.
itself?
When we looked at, I was thinking, oh, it's terrible. You catch me. I took my books in front of me. Several books have come out on Civil War memory. Martha Hodes did this one at the Lincoln Memorial, and she goes in the because there is about 10 years where there's a lot of reverence for Lincoln just depending where you're at, and a gleeful but secretive reverence for Booth. A that gotcha. Yeah, finally that. So there was a very deep hatred, and it goes back and forth because I remember reading, I think it was a minister, ironically, but there were politicians, ministers, activists, or journalists in the North at Lincoln's assassination. They wanted to literally shove Southerners right to the ocean and recolonize the South. I mean, there was literally that level of genocidal thinking in the North at Lincoln's assassination. I'm glad that only a handful of people felt that, that intensely. But so you had this really, back and forth here. So many Southerners were glad he's dead. However, they're occupied by Union troops. You don't want to stay too much.
Mm-hmm.
There was, I believe it was in Canandaigua, New York. Yes, I know it was. Carolyn Counts Richards, a young girl. She's a teenager. And somebody up there made a nasty comment about Lincoln and then had to leave for Canada very quickly. Very quickly.
Yeah. And
never come back. So depending on where you lived, but it would take a generation. I think the Blue-Gray reunions, which was, this is the lost cause, but they were both heroic. We fought for what we believed in, and we were both right. But you don't discuss right about what. You don't bring that out. I think much worse even than the Vietnam split between people. Going through that, and I lived through that one. What side were you on? Are you pro-war or anti-war? And what time during this event? But here, I think it's got to go until 1890s. When I look at it now, you start to see, because they're old. The Confederate, the officers are gone. The older officers, they've all passed away. There's young guys who are still around, and a lot of them really were not ideologically driven by this. Their anger was there because they fought an enemy, but the ideologues had died. The older ones who were driving the ideology, they mostly have died. You have an anger over the fight itself, over lost loved ones, but you don't have the ideology so much. As long as you forget or don't just talk about equality for African Americans or suffrage for African Americans. If you don't bring that up, we can kind of get along. And so there's a lot of whataboutisms too, where the push the North was to actually insist on Black voting rights in the South, but not in their own states. So that goes over really nicely, because you can see that.
The irony,
yeah. Okay, come on, guys. Let's try not to be that hypocritical. I'm sorry. Hypocrisy is the core of our nature here. But during this time period, I think hypocrisy is really at the root of our nature. Not in my backyard, not in my voting district.
Right.
And so that leads to many believe, was there anybody any good? Well, the Christian in me says, well, no, not really. There wasn't any good. Look at Isaiah. What does Isaiah? What was they have a man of unclean lips living in a land of unclean lips? Look at me. Look up. I know it's bad. And so I think the historians just say, yeah, you're right. There's no heroes. Not really. And I agree with this side here, and say, you have these flip-flops of sides, and then you realize how really complex things were, and wondering, how did we ever get through this? And then you wonder, oh, maybe we haven't. And some of that maybe, it's shifted a bit. It's not so much geographically centered anymore at one time, but we still have divisions which lead from that one. And it's not, like I said, it's not as racially based, particularly since the 60s and 70s. We still have class-based issues, but the anger goes back to that time. That I think the hypocrisy of the North. That I think that, remember reading that one recently. How many states in the North? I think 11, only no, only 5 actually had allowed voting rights even by the 1880s and 90s for African Americans in northern states. I says, what kind of example you're setting here? They don't want to set an example. They wanted to control the votes in the South, but not necessarily change themselves. And so it would take another 100 years, 150 years, actually 100 years to actually a multiracial society of equal footings. But that
Yeah.
would still be a rough slog. And I live in an area, Indianapolis, where it's still a rough slog, but it's class too. It's not just race, it's class as well.
Yeah, I find it fascinating. I did a video a few years ago on the channel about when Sherman returned to the South. He goes back and actually goes kind of, this is what I can forget if it's 10, maybe 20 years after the war's over. And he's coming through the cities of Atlanta, and he goes down to New Orleans and celebrates Mardi Gras. I mean, he's riding on a float and people are celebrating him. You know, he's not vilified down there. People aren't yelling obscenities at him as he's walking through Atlanta. They're holding parades for him, and from what we understand, it was a very civil event, and people respected him. But you can actually see, as some historians have pointed out, you can see that transition. Uh, right a couple of years after the war, he's fine and dandy, but by the time you get to the 1920s, 1930s, the entire image of General Sherman changes. And so that I find that fascinating in history. And I'm not a historian of memory, but I
Yeah.
think it's fascinating nonetheless to try to see those little patterns that we find with Abraham Lincoln, with William Sherman, even with Grant. Grant changes over time.
Well, Grant falls out of favor until very recently. Charnow and Ron White have done biographies in the last 10, 15 years, and they've kind of been the ones to bring Grant's reputation back. Ron White was a friend of mine. I think did a really lovely biography of Grant, where he's looking into his, again, the integrity, what he said, but that this guy was a hero. People really did revere him. And now we kind of, but I think part of our post Watergate, we're a jaded people. We're a very, very jaded people. And it's been very, and our own politicians encourage it, which is the strangest thing. we encourage it in ourselves. Come on, guys.
I mean, you're absolutely right. Grant has changed a lot just in the last few years. And I worked at the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library for a whole year.
Yeah, you did.
I helped annotate the Grant memoirs that were published by Harvard a few years ago.
You were there when the collection came in from, oh goodness, Supreme Court Justice. I can't remember anybody's name. This is terrible. I'm going to lose that.
I'm not sure. I don't remember any big collection coming in.
Frank Williams donated a major collection down there. I thought it was I thought it was that collection. I thought it went in with the Grant collection. I thought it went in next to the Grant collection. He had a Lincoln collection, then went with the Grant. I thought that was down there.
I don't remember if it was there when when it happened when I was there.
I remember that date. I don't remember the date, but Frank Williams is a major Lincoln collector, and he had I think he went down there. I'm pretty sure with the Grant collection, so it was playing with that one.
But you're right. Grant has become more of a hero now than he ever has been. And I think his story is very similar to Lincoln's in ways. Similar because they've come from pretty humble beginnings. And if even if it's not humble beginnings exactly for Grant, he's definitely humbled when he gets out of the army and he's, just down on his luck. I describe him as almost a failure in almost everything he tries until he gets in the army. But we see that again, that becomes an Americanness that we kind of see of Grant, just like we do with Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, we like that. That's and that's our myth. That's one of our great myths. It's not entirely fake. It's a lot of we have an area that has those opportunities. A lot of people, my own family included, going coal miners from Scotland, did well. in 2 generations, did quite well. Then but then the curmudgeons are okay. Well, how many didn't? You know, balance this one out.
Yep.
So there, it's not, but yet, but we love this one because we encourage it. We want that myth because we want to keep that in front of our faces, and that's a healthy thing. I think we want to keep that, because I think that's gives personal growth some motivation. It gives us some an opportunity or a belief that if I do this much, I can actually get myself out of the hole. Well, you don't just out of the hole. Others are helping you too.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it makes Lincoln human when you read about
Yeah,
him enough, and it makes Grant human when you read about him enough. And that's what happens with any historical character that you
yeah,
read. They become more human. And I think we see ourselves in many of these people, and sometimes
yeah.
we don't see us. And so we kind of understand ourselves even better when we read about these people.
A friend of mine, John Fia, talked about he looked at history as helping us understand the other.
Mhm.
Um, he looked at the of all the professions to help a student, even not a professional historian, but help us to grasp and be ready to handle people different from us, is to study history at a deeper level, so that you look at people who are drastically different in a foreign country, and then having to become sympathetic or empathetic, at least to understand where in the world did he get this idea? Why did she do this? What was she thinking?
Mhm.
And then you start, once you can begin to grasp that enough, other people current with our own age, you have a little more patience and a little more talent to not react badly when somebody acts in ways that are foreign to you. And so when I see somebody, what in the world were they thinking? And I realized, oh, they're coming out of this package, the context. I start really thinking, what's their baggage? My favorite language is. And I was, oh, okay, they were told this as a kid. They had these are their stories that they heard as a kid. You know, they may not always been true, but they're embedded in their memory. So, oh, okay, I'm sorry. My Sunday school class. I have a Sunday school class that the University said Indy, and it's a racially mixed class of 20 some people, 15, 20 people, and they're from vastly different experiences than I had. I mean, I grew up in a fairly affluent lake district in Michigan. These folks are are in the really rough areas. Some are homeless. And I thought, okay, so their background is a lot different than mine. And so misunderstandings are really possible.
Well, I don't want to take up any more of your time. I do want
I've been
to.
doing this.
Yeah, well, I have too. I do want to ask you one question before we
Yeah.
go, and I want to try to do this with every
Okay.
scholar I bring in. Is whenever was going through grad school, I had a professor tell me, said there is one book that you will use in almost every paper you write because that's kind of your field.
Ooh. Yeah.
And he showed me the book that he used in almost everything he wrote. Mine is Two Great Rebel Armies by Richard McMurray. That really kind of set the stage for what I write about.
Mhm.
And so, is there a book that you center your research around?
Ooh. My problem is I am a liberty gibbet. I
Mm,
have, because of being in public history. So I often feel I'm not an expert in anything. I do often do not feel like an expert. I feel like a phony. um, with Lincoln, I think Morel's, um, actually, no, I think this one right here. When I do memory of all sorts, I think Mystic Currents of Memory by Michael Kamen.
okay.
This has been one of them. If his student was my advisor for my dissertation. This is my academic grandfather. um, I think for that one. Michael Katz's In the Shadow of the Poorhouse is another one for my dealing with the research I was doing on poorhouse, 19th century poor care of all sorts. How, and that was another area of mine. Um, and my third area that I really The third one is the Methodist Circuit Riders. That's another area I spent years in. And the final one of my first, will stay with me, is, and this you remember this from the geography class, inland river navigation.
Yes, I remember it. I think you showed us pictures of the boat you.
I certainly did.
So yes, I remember that very well. I told you I remember that class more than almost any other class I've ever taken.
I'm honored. I am deeply honored. And I think those are the areas where I spent years of my career. And oh goodness, I don't remember what it was. Who was traveling by bateau up and down the James River from Lynchburg to Richmond, preaching at all the poorhouses along the way. Now, if I could just put Lincoln on that boat somehow. But that's what got
that boat.
Well, that's exact. That's what got mixed up when I was doing at LMU when I was reading. I bought the the Herndon's Informants, the big 900 page beast of all the text that William Herndon's Informants notes gave, and reading about the two of his trips on the Ohio and the Mississippi. That fascinated me. I said, I did it. I've come complete circle here. But I think what got me one was Lincoln's speech. I don't have a speech, but I know he spoke at the Harbors and Rivers Convention in 1847 in Chicago. And I thought, oh my goodness, there I am. There's a huge amount of my interest. Or actually, when Lincoln and it ran a campaign against Methodist Circuit Rider. This is terrible. Peter Cartwright.
Yes. Oh yeah. Yeah.
So those are my my go-tos. But the memory part, I would say, is Kamen's book. I discovered it pretty early on. But I still have my geography books. I still Wilbur Zielinski and Donald W. Meining. I still use those. Those are my context books. Those are my Bible for context, physical context. When I'm looking into another field, because I did that before I became a historian. I was a geographer, historical geographer. But I always felt that didn't have the chops because the museums could never go deep enough that we needed to do it. I was always upset that at the museum we simply had circus stories. And I knew we needed to go many layers deep. Even though the exhibit might be here, I needed to go way below this for the possibility of somebody else following along. I could not leave them up here. Yeah. And so I decided for the PhD program. It took me a long time, 10 years, but I got through it. But yeah, I think I'm sorry I'm not answering that question as good as you do tonight.
No.
I think because it's because I have not had the luxury or the curse of being a one note, being in one area of expertise, and that was my area. I think part of it is simply my own dysfunctional personality. But it made me really good at doing survey courses.
Absolutely.
I was very good. I could do this because I had no area, and I was eternally curious. I was just constantly curious. Even when I got to the 1970s, at Western Michigan University, and Dr. Martinez, who was like 20 years younger than me, 30 years younger than me, I talked all about this, and he loved the 70s. I says, I was there. You weren't. Well, I keep seeing this glitch here, and so
that's all right. I just appreciate you talking to me. I can't thank you enough, and you've made a big impact on my academic career, and I appreciate you so much coming on here and talking to me.
Thank you for bringing me on. Oh, I appreciate having you as a student, and I also appreciate being invited on. And also thank you, because I look forward to ways that I can still stay involved in public history, and in the podcast seems to be the one way of reaching people, and I look forward to doing these kind of activities even more.
Thank you so much.
And with you. Okay. Wish you well.